All right, hello. I'm going to be reading a book today. Starting a new book. I read books on stream every now and then. So I did the Federalist Papers two two Independence Days ago, and I think last year we also did more Federalist Papers, and we ended up finishing all of them on stream. And now I'm going to read The Conquest of a Continent by Madison Grant. So this is, I wouldn't say patriotic. Maybe it is. I guess we'll see. I've never read it, but it does give a like a history of migrations throughout the American continent, mostly the United States. So it should be pretty interesting. Give us like a good foundation of what built this country. I am American, and today is the 4th of July, so happy Independence Day. And this is how we're going to celebrate. So I have read some of Madison Grant's work before in the past, because I haven't read this one in particular. This was published in, I think, 1933 or 1934. And I read his Passing of the Great Race like 2 years ago, I think. And that was published in, I believe it was 1916. Let me double check that. Yep, 1916. Here we go. The Wikipedia article says The Passing of the Great Race is a 1916 racist and pseudoscientific book by American lawyer, anthropologist, and proponent of eugenics, Madison Grant. I don't know if I would agree with that statement, but Madison Grant was pretty heavily censored in the United States. I've talked about banned books on my streams before, and his is a good example, especially this Conquest of a Continent. I've read that it was heavily suppressed by the ADL. I was looking for anything connecting the ADL to this, like, reliable, like preferably something from the ADL's website itself, but I couldn't find anything. But I do know that this was suppressed. It wasn't really sold in stores. There was a lot of work done to kind of keep it a secret. It was allowed to be published, but there was no news printed about it or anything. It just kind of came and went. I first heard about it in a speech by Rockwell, and he was talking about how it was being suppressed at the time. This was in the 60s. And he said, bookstores just didn't have it. But now with the magic of the internet, we can read it. I do have the actual copy of this too. This is just a copy from the Internet Archive turned into a PDF. But I have a physical copy, the same edition and everything, for myself. It was pretty expensive, I have to say. But it's in the public domain. You can find it it's on Project Gutenberg, so it's not really suppressed anymore, but at the time it was. And I'm not sure how much this builds on his Passing of the Great Race. So when I usually take notes when I read, so I have my notes here that I took when I read Passing of the Great Race 2 years ago. And I'll just kind of try and cover some main points that it made. So he talks about extermination of a race through demographic replacement. He talks about basically categorizes Europeans in 3 categories, which I think I saved a picture. I'll pull that up. Yeah, there we go. So this is a map that comes in The Passing of the Great Race. He divides Europeans into Nordics, Alpines, and Mediterraneans, and these are the white race, as it were. So the Mediterraneans are, people that were around the Mediterranean. The Alpines are kind of Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And then the Nordics are like Northern Europe and bleeding into Central Europe a little bit. And he believed in hierarchy, like a lot of people back then. He put Nordics and Mediterraneans more or less equal. He does have a bias towards Nordics, I think just because of his own genetic makeup, his own background. But he never, as far as I remember, he never really says that Mediterraneans were less than Nordics, but he does say Alpines are less than both. The round-skulled Central European folk. So that's basically the gist of his layout of Europe and the races. And I think we'll see in this Conquest of a Continent, he's going to talk about how these races migrated over to the United States and where in the United States they migrated over to. So I think this is a good thing to go over before we actually start the book. But I'll get rid of that now. So let's see, what else do we talk about? He talks about war as a degenerative element. The best men die, and then the people who didn't fight in the war are left to reproduce. I've seen arguments to both of those things, but this is just Madison Grant's belief. Let's see. I'm just skimming my notes here. So he does talk about Aryans. You'll see the term Aryan probably in this one. For Madison Grant, Aryan is a linguistic group. So any people that speak Indo-European languages fall into the Aryan category, where we kind of in the vernacular now call Aryan. That would be more like Nordic in Grant's terminology. So that's something to keep in mind while we're reading here. So yeah, Grant gives a lot of credit to the Mediterraneans. Like I said, he basically put them in the same level as the Nordics. He believes that Mediterraneans were superior in the arts, and Nordics were superior in literature and science. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. That's just what he said. So we'll just accept it. We'll just accept it on its face for now. He was anti-nationalist, so some people. I've read that Madison Grant was a heavy influence on Hitler and his view on race. I think that was like on the Wikipedia article. There was no source, of course, and I don't know if that's accurate. I've read a fair amount about that period and never saw anything really about Madison Grant. If anything, I would say he was more of an influence on Alfred Rosenberg, potentially. His Passing of the Great Race is very similar to Alfred Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century, as far as the racial history is concerned. As far as influencing Hitler, if you want to believe Wikipedia, go ahead, but I don't necessarily trust that assessment. So Grant, about nationalism, he says that their nationalist movements are a result of a weaker race rising up against a stronger race. So you'll have, say the French Revolution had, the spiteful mutants rising up against the well-bred aristocracy, that sort of thing. I'd say, in that case, it's probably true, and in other cases, it's not necessarily true. The Bolshevik Revolution was another case of spiteful mutants rising up. I don't know if I'd really call that a nationalist movement. So it's hit or miss, I guess. But I think, as far as that goes, I think he was talking about the Civil War. He was the son of a Union Army officer, so he still had a bit of a bias against the southern states. So I think he was talking about the rise of the rebellion in the South. And that's more or less it for my notes. The main picture, anyway. So I'll close that. And we'll get into the book, I guess. I have it here. So this is a scan of the copy that I have from the Internet Archive. It's the, I believe, the first edition, 1933 copy. So I wasn't able to get a copy with the dust jacket. It has this like emblem here. It's textured. It has like a 3D texture, I guess. So it's kind of strange that it would even have a dust jacket. But other than not having a dust jacket, my copy is pretty pristine. Not to brag, but it's very nice. This is an old library book, so it's not as good as mine, but it'll do. Let's see. I don't know. I can't read that. Grateful? And then I don't know about the rest. The Folks. I can see that. February 1934. Fred something. All right. And this is the title page, Conquest of a Continent or the Expansion of Races in America by Madison Grant. 1933. Dedicated to his brother, DeForest Grant. And somebody sketched a name and a date in here. 3/28/56. That was a while ago. There's Chris something. Chris Hill. Chris Hill, maybe? Hill. Yeah, fuck that guy, man. And fuck this guy, too. Anyone who writes in a book, fuck them. Alright, so I guess we'll just read the introduction and then get into the table of contents, because that's after the introduction for some reason. So as you can see, there isn't a whole lot of text on the page, so I'm hoping it is 448 pages, this PDF. I'm not sure how much of that is the actual text, how much is going to be like an index or anything, but it's fairly long, I'd say. But there isn't much text on the page, so hopefully it won't take us too long to get through. Not as long as the Federalist Papers, you know. That took us a while. It was like a year and a half. But we'll start with the introduction. The character of a country depends upon the racial character of the men and women who dominate it. I welcome this volume as the first attempt to give an authentic racial history of our country, based on the scientific interpretation of race as distinguished from language and from geographic distribution. The most striking induction arising through research into the prehistory of man is that racial characters and predispositions governing racial reactions to certain old and new conditions of life extend far back of the most ancient civilizations. For example, the characteristics which Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey attributed to his heroes and to his imaginary gods and goddesses were not the product of the civilization which existed in his time in Greece. They were the product of creative evolution long prior even to the beginnings of Greek culture and government. This creative principle, the most mysterious of the recently discovered phenomena of evolution, to which I have devoted the researches of nearly half a century, is that racial preparation for various expressions of civilization, art, law, government, etc., is long antecedent to these institutions. Ripley missed this point in his superb researches into the racial constitution of the peoples of Europe. Grant partly based his passing of the Great Race on Ripley's researches, but did not carry out the purely anatomical analysis to its logical endpoint, namely that moral, intellectual, and spiritual traits are just as distinctive and characteristic of different races as are head form, hair and eye color, physical stature, and other data of anthropologists. In the present volume, which I regard as an entirely original and essential contribution to the history of the United States of America, Grant goes much further, and in tracing back the racial origins of the majority of our people, he lays the foundation for an understanding of the peculiar characteristics of American civilization, which, all agree, is of a very new type, something the world has never before seen. Grant supports Ripley in his distinction between three great European stocks, Nordic, Alpine, Mediterranean. He gives very strong additional reasons for one of his own earlier inductions, namely, that the Aryan language was invented by primitive peoples of the Nordic race before its dispersal in the 3rd millennium BC from the steppe country in the southeast of Russia. This superb and flexible language doubtless aided the Nordic race in its conquest of Europe, in its ever westward journey across the Atlantic, in its Anglo-Saxon occupation of our continent, and its stamping of Anglo-Saxon institutions on American government and civilization. We all recognize that, like all other languages, Aryan is purely a linguistic and not a racial term, just as French is spoken equally by the Norman Nordics of the north of France, by the Alpines of the center, and by the Mediterraneans of the south. My faith is unshaken in the ultimately beneficial recognition of racial values and in the stimulating and generous emulation aroused by racial consciousness. Let this stimulation be without prejudice to other racial values, which should be duly recognized and evaluated, values we Anglo-Saxons do not naturally possess. Moreover, I set great store by the great mass of documentary evidence assembled by Grant in the present volume. I think it explodes the bubble of the opponents of racial values that they are merely myths. The theme of the present work is that America was made by Protestants of Nordic origin, and that their ideas about what makes true greatness should be perpetuated. That this is a precious heritage which we should not impair or dilute by permitting the entrance and dominance of alien values and peoples of alien minds and hearts. Finally, I would like to define clearly my own position on these very important racial questions which arouse so much heat, so much bad feeling, so much misrepresentation. I object strongly to the assumption that one race is superior or inferior to another, just as I object to the assumption that all races are alike or even equal. Such assumptions are wholly unwarranted by facts. Equality or inequality, superiority and inferiority are all relative terms. For example, around the equator, the black races and certain of the colored and tinted races are superior to the white races and may be capable, under certain conditions, of creating great civilizations. In a torrid climate and under a burning sun, witness the marvelous achievements of the Mediterranean race in Mesopotamia, Egypt, North Africa, Cambodia, and India between 4000 BC and 1250 AD. Or, coming nearer home to the cool mountain regions, witness the great achievements of the Alpine race in engineering and mathematics and in astronomy. It follows that racial superiority and inferiority are partly matters of the intellectual and spiritual evolution which guides one race after another into periods of great ascent, too often followed by sad and catastrophic decline. In this, as in all other interminglings of science and sentiment, let us not extenuate nor write in malice, but always in broad-mindedness and a truly generous spirit. It is with the greatest pleasure that I have written a few words endorsing this book as the first racial history of America, or in fact of any nation. I stand with the author not only in nailing his colors to the mast, but in giving an entirely indisputable historic, patriotic, and governmental basis to the fact that in its origin and evolution, our country is fundamentally Nordic. It's Henry Fairfield Osborn in August of 1933. So I don't know who Ripley is that he's talking about here. A first name would be nice, or a last name. I'm assuming that's the last name already, though. So maybe I can do a quick Google search. Ripley racial demographics. Ripley, Tennessee. Okay. Racial science. William Z. Ripley. Yeah, I think that's a hit right there. An American economist, lecturer at Columbia University, professor of economics at MIT, professor of political economy at Harvard University, and anthropologist of race. He's famous for his criticisms of American railroad economics and American business practices in the 20s and 30s, and later for his tripartite racial theory of Europe. His contribution to the anthropology of race was later taken up by racial, physical anthropologists, eugenicists, white supremacists, nordicists, and racists in general. It was considered a valid academic work at the time, although today it's considered to be a prime example of scientific racism and pseudoscience. Well, that's Wikipedia, and according to Wikipedia, race doesn't exist at all, so you can take those later accusations as you wish. So acknowledgements, we'll go ahead and read this. First and foremost, the author desires to express his appreciation of the assistance of his research associate, Dr. Paul Popenoe, who collected authorities and statistics during an intensive study lasting over 4 years. He also desires to express his appreciation for the sympathy and aid of Professor Henry Fairfield Osborn and of Charles Stewart Davison, Esquire. The latter carefully revised the text and made many valuable suggestions. The author owes a special debt of gratitude to Dr. Clarence G. Campbell for much assistance and to Dr. Harry H. Laughlin for many of the statistics and analyses used in this book. His thanks are due also to Captain John B. Trevor, whose masterly study of the early population has been a great help, and have the studies of Messrs. Howard F. Barker and Marcus L. Hansen. He also wishes to acknowledge the assistance of Mr. A. E. Hamilton. Colonel William Wood of Quebec has been of great assistance in the data given regarding the origin of the French habitants in Canada. The writer is also obligated to Professor E. Prakash of Yale University for his assistance on several critical points. The American Geographical Society and Mr. Ray R. Platt were instrumental in providing the maps used in this volume, and the author takes this opportunity to express his thanks to them both. All right, good job to all those guys. So here we have a table of contents. We'll get into the good shit. So there's the introduction. We read that already. Forward, the cradle of mankind, the Nordic conquest of Europe, the Nordic settlement of America, the Puritans in New England, the gateways to the west from New England and Virginia, Virginia and her neighbors, the Old Northwest Territory, the mountaineers conquer the Southwest from the Mississippi to the Oregon, the spoils of the Mexican War, the alien invasion, the transformation of America, checking the alien invasion, the legacy of slavery, our neighbors on the south, our neighbors on the north, and then our neighbors on the south, the Nordic outlook, and then there's a bibliography and an index. So I guess it's only about 359 pages. Not, 448. So it's not too bad. Not too bad. I will try to get through these two today. We'll see how it goes. I'm not sure, if we'll make good time or not. In the past, doing reading streams, my voice is only good for maybe an hour and a half, like 2 hours tops. So we'll see where we get in an hour. I think we can get up here though. I think we're good. I did hear that in this book, he goes through every single state. The migrations and everything through every single state. And it can get a little tedious. That's what I read. So we'll just get through it, you know. But I have heard that this is a good book. So I'm looking forward to it. But that's just a warning. And as usual, I will not censor myself. I won't censor any of the language in this book. I'm going to read it as it appears on the page. I did do a quick Control F for any N-bombs, and there are none. Negro features quite a bit, but that's just kind of expected for the time period. I just worry about YouTube automatically, striking me for the N word. I did say it once in another reading, but it looks like it won't be a problem here, so that's good. So there's some maps throughout the book. There's a map of Ireland, the Highlands and Lowlands of Scotland, Ulster Scot and New England origins, Puritan emigration from England, territorial growth of the United States, the 13 colonies, Roman Catholics in 1930, congregational churches, the Negro population in 1930, the Negro population, their increase and decrease from 1920 to 1930, the Dominion of Canada and Newfoundland, Mexico, Central America, and the West Indies, the distribution of Mexicans by states, and South America. So I do like maps in books, so I'm glad. Passing of the Great Race had some maps, but I read a digital copy and it had none of the maps in it. I had to find them on my own. So I'm glad we'll get to see them here. And here we go. Conquest of a Continent. Chapter 1, The Foreword. American public sentiment regarding the admission of aliens has undergone recently a profound change. At the end of the 19th century, a fatuous humanitarianism prevailed and immigrants of all kinds were welcomed to the refuge of the oppressed, regardless of whether they were needed in our industrial development or whether they tended to debase our racial unity. The myth of the melting pot was, at that time, deemed by the unthinking to be a part of our national creed. Wow. Already, this could be written today. And I don't like interrupting chapters while I'm reading, but I'm going to interrupt here. I read a lot of books from this time period, the early 20th century. A guy at work saw a book I was reading a little while ago, and he was like, "Do you read anything from this century?" And no, I don't really. I don't really think it's necessary because I can read about everything last century and it's exactly the same. The only difference is that these books have stood the test of time, and the ones that are written now have not had that chance yet. So I'm going to use my limited lifespan to read something that I know is worthwhile. And, you know, if people are supporting books that are written nowadays, that's great. But I'm not going to do that for the most part. I do actually read a couple more recent books, but not as much, not anywhere near as much. So you'll find the beginning of the 20th century, there were a lot of the same problems back then as we have now, and people proposed solutions for them back then, and nobody listened to them. And now we still have these problems. So I think it's a good place to look if you want answers. But anyway, sorry about the interruption, but we'll continue. This general attitude was availed of and encouraged by the steamship companies, which felt the need of the supply of live freight. The leading industrialists and railroad builders were equally opposed to any check on the free entry of cheap labor. Restrictionists were active, and in number they were relatively few until the World War aroused the public to the danger of mass migration from the countries of devastated and impoverished Europe. As a result of the problems raised by the World War A stringent immigration law was passed in 1924 and is now in force. And there's a footnote here. This bill was framed and passed through the efforts of Honorable Albert Johnson of Washington. A new Declaration of Independence, it has been happily called. This law has, for its basic principle, a provision that the total number of persons allowed to enter the United States from countries to which quotas have been assigned shall be so apportioned as to constitute a cross-section of the then existent white population of the United States. This is the so-called national origins provision. A controversy immediately arose over this new basis, as it was to the interest of every national and religious group of aliens now here to exaggerate the importance and size of its contribution to the population of our country, especially in colonial times. This was particularly true of immigrants from those nations such as Germany and Ireland, the quotas of which were greatly reduced under the new law. The purpose of this opposition was to warp public opinion in regard to the merits of various national groups and to exaggerate the non-Anglo-Saxon elements in the old colonial population. This book is an effort to make an estimate of the various elements, national and racial, existing in the present population of the United States and to trace their arrival and subsequent spread. In the days of our fathers, the white population of the United States was practically homogeneous. Racially, it was the preponderantly English and Nordic. At the end of the colonial period, we had a population about 90% Nordic and over 80% British in origin. In spite of the intrusion of two foreign elements of importance, both nevertheless chiefly Nordic, our population and our institutions remained overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon down to the time of the Civil War. Since that time, there has been an ever-increasing tendency to change the nature of this once American people into a mosaic of national, racial, and religious groups. The question to what extent this transformation has gone deserves careful study. The draft lists for the American Army in the large cities during the World War showed an amazing collection of foreign names. These lists are most dramatic indications of the substantial modifications of the original Anglo-Saxon character of the population which have occurred. A vivid illustration is found in a war poster issued by an enthusiastic clerk of foreign extraction in the Treasury Department during one of the appeals for Liberty loans. A Howard Chandler Christie girl of pure Nordic type was shown pointing with pride to a list of names, saying, "Americans all." The list was Dubois, Smith, O'Brien, Seika, Hauk, Papandrikopoulos, Andrassy, Voloto, Levy, Turovich, Kowalski, Kriskianevich, Knutson, Gonzalez. Apparently, the one Native American, so far as he figures at all, is hidden under the sobriquet of Smith, and there is possibly the implied suggestion that the beautiful lady was herself the product of this remarkable melange. Similar foreign names are beginning to appear and sometimes predominate in the list of college graduates, successful athletes, and minor politicians. In the words of the late President Theodore Roosevelt, we are becoming a polyglot boarding house. The modification of the religious complexion of the nation is also very striking. In colonial times, Americans were almost unanimously Protestants. Now the claim is made that 1 in every 7 is a Catholic and 1 in 30 a Jew. To what extent this change is due to immigration and to what extent to the differential birth rate should be carefully considered. In dealing with racial admixture, we should be certain that we are not considering merely nationality, religion, or language. In popular thought, there is such a racial entity as the German, the Russian, the Frenchman, or the Italian. These, however, are not racial but national terms. In a few cases of still unmixed peoples, like those of Sweden and Norway, nationality, language, religion, and race coincide. But in Germany, for instance, the Germans along the North Sea and the Baltic coasts are Protestant Nordics, while those of Bavaria, of Austria, and of other parts of the south are Catholic Alpines. Italy, north of the Apennines, is largely Alpine, slightly mixed with Nordic, while Naples and Sicily in the south are purely Mediterranean by race. In France, where there is a mixed Nordic, Mediterranean, and Alpine population, a single language and an ancient tradition have created an intense unity of national feeling, and in recent decades there has been a marked transfer of political control from the Nordic to the Alpine element, as evidenced by the names and features of the present political leaders. In Belgium there are 2 languages, in Switzerland 4, to say nothing of the medley of languages in the old Austrian Empire. Only in Switzerland is there national unity, in spite of a diversity of tongue. In America, the events of the last 100 years, especially the vast tide of immigration, have greatly impaired our purity of race and our unity of religion, and even threatened our inheritance of English speech. If our English language is saved, it will be due in no small degree to the growing world power of the language itself, and of its literature, as well as to the worldwide ocean commerce of Great Britain and her overseas empire. In the United States today, this unity of language is vigorously opposed by the foreign language press. In all probability, however, this foreign press is doomed to die out as the older generation of immigrants passes from the scene. The fact that this non-English press represents a score or more of different languages makes it impossible for it in the long run to oppose successfully the English language. In Canada, the fact that the French language is officially recognized in Quebec, and for that matter in the Parliament at Ottawa, makes the problem there more difficult. It may here be noted that the French language as spoken in Quebec is sneered at and ridiculed by the European French. The use of French speech in Quebec, like the attempted use of Erse in Ireland and Czechish in Bohemia, is merely serving to keep those speaking such language out of touch with modern literature and culture. The absurdity of attempting to revive an obsolete language such as Erse is shown by its lack of literature of modern type. Sir Harry H. Johnston once said to the author that Erse was a perfectly good language except for 2 facts. First, that nobody could pronounce it, and second, that nobody could spell it. How do you pronounce it then? Or does he just mean the words in the language? It's
Erse.
okay. So I guess they just mean the words in the language. In Louisiana, French is still spoken by the Creoles of New Orleans and by the French and Negro mixture called Cajuns. This linguistic diversity will in due course of time also disappear. More serious is the retention in use in New Mexico of the Spanish language by its Mexican Indian population. Few people know that New Mexico is officially bilingual. Sooner or later this must be stopped, as it has greatly hindered the development of the state. As to race, as distinct from language, religion, and nationality, we must consider our country today as being in large part a heterogeneous mixture of racial groups and individuals. Since America's first duty is to herself and to the people already here, she must weigh the effect upon the present, as well as upon the future, of such racial admixture as has already occurred, and which promises to spread indefinitely. A striking example of this was shown during the Washington Bicentennial in 1932, when some historians, in their efforts to placate the assertive groups of aliens in our midst, endeavored to show the existence in the colonies of substantial groups of these same aliens. For instance, they claimed that most of the revolutionary personages of Irish descent were the same as the South Irish Catholics of today. That is wholly error. The so-called Irish of the Revolution were Ulster Scots, either from the lowlands of Scotland or from North England, who came to the colonies by way of the north of Ireland, after having lived there for 2 or 3 generations. These Ulster Scots were reinforced by Protestant English, who emigrated from Leinster, and both were widely removed religiously and culturally from the South Irish Catholics, who did not come to this country in any numbers until the potato famine in Ireland in the 1840s drove them across the seas. To take an example, in the Convention of 1787, which formulated the Constitution, certain individuals were put down as Irish. These were Protestant Ulster Scots. In the Senate of today, a few of the senators are put down as Irish. These are South Irish Catholics. To use the same term for these 2 different types of population is erroneous. They were widely separated religiously, racially, and culturally. The same thing is true of that part of our population which was referred to as French. The French of the American Revolution and our Constitutional Convention were Huguenot French who, though few in numbers, took a prominent part in public affairs at the time of the Revolution. They were, for the most part, Nordic and were English-speaking. They were a distinguished group which had nothing whatever in common with the habitant French of Quebec, who are Catholic Alpines. To call them both French is erroneous. A similar but less marked distinction exists between the North Germans and the Palatines. And they both differ from the South Germans in America, who are mostly Catholic Alpines. In this connection, it should be clearly understood that in discussing the various European races, we are concerned only with such individuals of those races as came to America, and not with the populations which remained in the original homeland. In colonial times, the Anglo-Saxon American avoided the danger arising from intermarriage with natives, which ruined the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the New World and threatened the destruction of the French colonies in Quebec. There was some crossbreeding between Englishmen and Indian squaws along the frontier, but the offspring was everywhere regarded as an Indian, just as a mulatto in the English colonies was regarded as belonging to the Negro race. This racial prejudice kept the white race in America pure, while its absence and the scarcity of white women ultimately destroyed European supremacy in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. At the time of the settlement of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, the Roman Church was dominant. Its chief motive was to save souls for heaven rather than to perpetuate the control of Europeans. That church, therefore, favored marriage of the Europeans, Spaniard and Portuguese, with the native women and considered the children to be white. The same was true of the mixtures of French and Indians in Quebec, and the church recognized the resulting half-breed offspring as French and not native. This policy of the church was aided by the lack of race dignity, which is even today found sometimes among the French, the Spaniards, and the Portuguese. For example, in the south of Portugal, there was a large Negro slave element introduced in the 16th century, which is now absorbed into the surrounding population. Similar conditions exist in South Italy, where there is a substantial Negroid element, probably descended from the Negro slaves introduced by the Romans from Africa some 2,000 years ago. One of the unfortunate results of racial mixture or miscegenation between diverse races is disharmony in the offspring. In the more widely separated the parent stocks, the greater is this lack of harmony likely to be in both mental and physical characters. Herbert Spencer, in response to a request for advice, writing in 1892 to the Japanese statesman Baron Keniko Kintaro, stated this biological fact very clearly when he said, "To your remaining question respecting the intermarriage of foreigners and Japanese, which you say is now very much agitated among our scholars and politicians, and which you say is one of the most difficult problems, my reply is that, as rationally answered, there is no difficulty at all. It should be positively forbidden. It is not at root a question of social philosophy. It is at root a question of biology." There is abundant proof, alike furnished by the intermarriages of human races and by the interbreeding of animals, that when the varieties mingled diverge beyond a certain slight degree, the result is inevitably a bad one in the long run. When, say, of the different varieties of sheep, there is an interbreeding of those which are widely unlike, the result, especially in the second generation, is a bad one. There arises an incalculable mixture of traits, and what may be called a chaotic constitution. The same thing happens among human beings. The Eurasians in India, the half-breeds in America, show this. The physiological basis of this experience appears to be that any one variety of creature, in course of many generations, acquires a certain constitutional adaptation to its particular form of life, and every other variety similarly acquires its own special adaptation. The consequence is that if you mix the constitution of two widely divergent varieties, which have severally become adapted to widely divergent modes of life, you get a constitution which is adapted to the mode of life of neither, a constitution which will not work properly because it is not fitted for any set of conditions whatever. By all means, therefore, peremptorily interdict marriages of Japanese with foreigners. The relative diminution of Anglo-Saxon blood in America and the present check to the expansion of the British Empire are due partly to the curious sentimental quality of the Anglo-Saxon mind, the effect of which is almost suicidal. It is a striking fact that tragic and even fatal consequences may arise from the noblest motives. The abolition of the obsolete institution of slavery occupied the minds of some of the best men of the 19th century, and serfdom was only stamped out finally at immense cost to the finest elements of our Anglo-Saxon stock. Looking back over these events at a distance of a half-century, there appear many considerations which were neglected by those who were too close to the conflict to see into the future. Let us consider the consequences in the world at large of the abolition of slavery and the breaking down of the barrier maintained by that institution between the whites and the blacks. For instance, in the British Empire, the abolition of slavery 100 years ago contributed in large part to the decline and finally to the almost complete disappearance of pure Nordic blood in the West Indies, where previously there had been rich and flourishing colonies of white men employing black slaves. In South Africa, the revolt and outtrekking of Boers beyond the Vaal River were due largely to the abolition of slavery and to the sentimental treatment of the slaves by the home government. The passions engendered at that time ultimately led to two bloody and useless wars between the Nordic peoples of South Africa. Other European nations suffered similarly from the abolition of slavery in their American colonies. Undiluted white blood has almost disappeared in Jamaica and Puerto Rico, while the natives of the Virgin Islands are nearly all Negroes and mulattoes. The most tragic result of the loss of white control of the blacks was shown in the history of Haiti and Santo Domingo. The freeing of the slaves and the disturbances resulting from the French Revolution had as a consequence the massacre or exile of practically every white person in the island. The French doctrinaires were responsible to some extent for this. Even Lafayette was president of the Société des Amis des Noirs. Today, the black inhabitants of this great island have reverted almost to barbarism. The islands and coasts of the entire Caribbean Sea, with much of the coasts of the Gulf of Mexico, are fast becoming Negro land, and apparently in the near future, the European element will be more and more in a hopeless minority. In the United States, we have a startling example of the effect of sentimentalism upon Nordic survival. The North was entirely right in endeavoring to keep slavery out of Kansas and the new states of the West, to that extent avoiding the color problem there. The sentimental interference with slavery, however, on the part of the Northern abolitionists, helped to precipitate the bloody Civil War and to destroy a very large portion of the best stock of the nation, especially in the South. The Southerners also were greatly to blame for their utter folly in seceding as a means of maintaining their peculiar institution, as they termed it. If the question of slavery had been left alone, the issue of the preservation of the Union would have been postponed for at least a generation. In time, the overwhelming numbers and wealth of the North would have made any serious question of secession an absurdity. As a consequence of the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of men of Nordic stock were cut off in the full vigor of manhood, who otherwise would have lived to propagate their kind and populate the West. Besides this, slavery as an institution was outside of the pale of civilization long before the Civil War, and it would have been peacefully abolished in a few decades through economic causes. The blacks themselves were raised by slavery from sheer savagery to a feeble imitation of white civilization, and they made more advance in America in 2 centuries than in as many thousand years in Africa. The presence of slaves, however, was injurious to the whites. Serfdom has been a curse wherever it has flourished in the New World, and it has had a profoundly demoralizing effect on the masters. American democracy at the start rested on a base of population that was, as already said, homogeneous in race, religion, tradition, and language, and in a relative equality of wealth. All these features are things of the past, and democracy has virtually broken down in spite of the fatuous ecstasy which characterizes the utterances of sentimentalists, who even claim that the World War was fought to make the world safe for democracy. It seems strange that this so-called liberal point of view is so short-sighted that we have in our midst today organizations and groups who, with the best intentions, are encouraging the Negro within, and the black, brown, and yellow men without, to dispute the dominance over the world at large of Christian Europeans and Americans. Throughout the world, there has gone forth a challenge to white supremacy, and this movement in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere has been fostered by the Christian missionaries. It has even gone so far that it is openly stated that any assertion of race supremacy or even discussion of race distinctions in this country should be suppressed in the interests of the spread of Christianity in foreign countries, notably Japan. In the long run, however, these doctrines will work great injury to the Protestant churches if they persist in taking an anti-national point of view. While many of the individual ministers are well-meaning and kindly, their education is undeveloped in world affairs, and their advice in such matters on which they are uninstructed is often very dangerous. Sentimental sympathy for other races of mankind is manifest today all over the world, but especially among Anglo-Saxons. It received a great impetus from President Wilson's doctrine of the right of self-determination. The fruits of this doctrine can be seen in the rise of so-called nationalism everywhere, as in Ireland, Bohemia, Poland, Egypt, and the Philippines, China, and India. The racially suicidal result of all this is the undermining of the control of the Nordic races over the natives. The upper classes, and in many cases the peasantry in eastern Germany, for example, are Nordics. One of the tragic consequences of the World War was the taking of political power in this region from the Nordics and transferring it, under the guise of democratic institutions, to Alpine Slavs. In Soviet Russia also, through the massacre and exile of the Nordic upper classes, political power has passed into the hands of Alpines, exactly as in France during the Revolution. The Alpine lower classes destroyed the Nordic nobility and assumed control of the state. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, which followed, killed off an undue proportion of Nordics in France, and are said to have greatly shortened the stature of the French soldiers. The revolt against European control, especially in the Orient, is becoming more and more pronounced. As said above, it has been encouraged unintentionally by the missionaries, who in educating the natives succeed only in arousing them to assert their equality with the European races. Probably the greatest tragedy in the world today is the corrosive jealousy of the fair skin of the white races felt by those whose skin is black, yellow, or brown. The world will hear more of this as the revolt of the lower races spreads. One of the manifestations of this jealousy of the fair skin of the Nordics is shown in those numerous cases where members of the colored races, or even dark-skinned members of the Nordic race, regard the possession of a blonde woman as an assertion and proof of race equality. This has been true historically since the earliest times. It is more than ever in evidence at the present day. All the foregoing points to the value of a critical consideration of the racial composition of the original 13 colonies and an analysis of the situation as it is today. All right, so that's chapter 1. Yeah, a lot of similarities to today. He talks about this sort of suicidal empathy and Christian missionaries asserting equality and promoting immigration and all this sort of integration. We see that a lot today. A lot of Christian NGOs bring migrants over to the United States. And he does call, this is something I forgot to mention earlier. So he talks about the revolution in Russia, which was mostly Jews, and the communists. They were mostly Jews at the time, and he calls them Alpines, which is one of the European races. So Grant does put Jews in as Europeans. He says Sephardics are Mediterraneans, and the Ashkenazi Jews are Alpines. That's how he classifies them. So it's kind of ironic that the ADL supposedly suppressed this book, even though he spoke pretty favorably about Jews and included them among his fellow whites, as it were. I'll see if my tea is not too hot. Yeah, it's still pretty hot. Well, I'll sip on this tea a little bit, and then we'll start chapter 2. I think we made good time. I think we'll be able to finish this, the second chapter. I'll have to take some tea breaks, but that's just how it is. You know, tea breaks are fine. So, Chapter 2, The Cradle of Mankind. Man is an immensely ancient animal. Over 1 million years have elapsed since he first made fire, and more millions since he became a bipedal pre-human. He left the forests at the latest, at the end of the Miocene, and not less than 7 million years ago, and ventured out into the plains of Central Asia as a savage, powerful, clever biped, hunting in packs or by sheer wit, securing his prey single-handed by pitfalls and other devices, the invention of which marks the development of growing intelligence. Man's initial differentiation from his simian ancestry probably began when he came down from the trees and began to walk erect. The hand was then liberated from its use as an instrument of locomotion and was devoted primarily to defense, attack, discovery, and invention. It is by means of the opportunities afforded by the hand that the human brain has evolved into man's most important factor in racial survival. Clear evidence of man's remote arboreal ancestry is offered by his stereoscopic or double-eyed vision. The great majority of ground animals, especially those living in the forest, have eyes on the sides of their heads, but in man's arboreal ancestors, by the recession of the intervening nasal and facial bones, the eyes were brought around to the front of the face. The resulting stereoptic vision enabled him to judge distance far more accurately than most mammals. Such power of determining distance is of course vital to an arboreal animal. Failure to judge accurately the length of a leap from branch to branch would be fatal. One often hears it stated that man has lost his sense of smell, but this sense was probably never better developed within the human period than it is now. In the trees, a sense of smell is not of much value. The monkey can sit on a branch and jabber with impunity at the leopard on the ground below. To forest animals like the deer or boar, however, the sense of smell is the surest protection against attack and is much more highly developed than the sense of sight, which latter is often quite feeble. In fact, in the thick jungle it is almost useless, and at black night completely so. Eurasia, where it is probable that mankind originated, was the greatest landmass on the globe in tertiary times. Modern Europe and North Africa formed relatively small peninsulas in the extreme west of this tertiary landmass. It is probably from Eurasia that man spread out to the uttermost parts of the habitable globe, carrying with him his language and such cultural features as had developed at the time of each successive migration. No race or language or cultural invention seems to have entered Eurasia from adjoining land areas. All went out, none came in. While the original center of dispersal of the hominidae, or human family, was probably Eurasia, it was at a later date also the center of the evolution of the higher types of man. To the northeast of Eurasia lay the ancient land connection with North America via Alaska, over which various species of animals passed back and forth, some of them having their origin in Asia and others in western North America. It was undoubtedly over this land connection that man first entered America at a relatively recent period, and probably he came in successive waves. The American Indians appear to have been derived from the Mongoloid tribes of northeastern Asia, before the latter had developed some of the extreme specializations which characterize the typical Mongols of Central Asia and China proper today. Judging from the culture which these American Indians brought with them, this migration began before 10,000 BC. The existing races of mankind, and those either entirely extinct or now absorbed in other races, had their distinctive areas of differentiation and periods of radiation from Eurasia over the habitable globe. The most primitive types are now found farthest from this original center of distribution, in countries where, through isolation, they escaped competition with the higher types which evolved later. The weight of evidence appears to show that Africa or Ethiopia, lying far to the southwest of Eurasia, was peopled in earliest times by way of Arabia by a most primitive Negroid type of mankind, while north of the Sahara, migrations from Asia have continued until recent times. The South was left for a vast period in possession of the Negro, while today, aside from the recent infiltration of whites and browns, Africa south of the Sahara belongs to three Negroid groups: the Negroes proper, the Pygmies or Negrillos, and the Bushmen and Hottentots. These three human types are characterized by very dark or yellow skin, tightly curled hair, very scanty body hair, flaring nostrils, flattened noses, and an absence of supraorbital ridges. Again, Australia, Tasmania, and some of the adjoining islands are, or recently were, inhabited by what used to be considered one of the great divisions of mankind, the Australoids. These people have the black skin and certain features of the Negro, but differ from him in the possession of abundant body hair and of marked supraorbital ridges. Also, the Australoid head hair is wavy and not closely curled. A most important characteristic, the profound cleavage between the Negroes and the Australoids is now questioned in some quarters. The differentiation of the human species into types, so distinctly contrasted as whites and blacks, and the problems of the evolution of higher types of man from the original stocks, bring us to a new classification of the genus Homo. Some anthropologists still maintain that all human beings are included in the species Homo sapiens, but this is an old-fashioned grouping. Sooner or later, a new system must be formulated based on the same fundamental rules that are applied to the classification of other mammals. For instance, the physical differences between the Nordics and the Negroes, the Australoids and the Mongols, if found among the lower mammals, would be much more than sufficient to constitute not only separate species, but even subgenera, and they are now so regarded by some anthropologists. And you can still see this discussion happening today in some places, although now it's, Grant's prediction was wrong here. Now it's unpopular to say such a thing, but the general consensus is that everyone's the same. All right, let's continue. Race is hard to define. It consists in the presence of a collection of hereditary characters common to the great majority of individuals in a given group. It lies in the preponderance of such characters as color of skin, hair, and eyes, facial and nasal contour, shape of skull, and even mental characteristics, which are more difficult to classify, but which are distinctly typical of specific human groups. Many individuals possess all the hereditary characteristics of a given race, but man is so ancient a being and intermixture has been so widespread that nearly every race shows signs of blending with others. This is especially true in Europe, where the intermingling of people has been extensive during the past 20 centuries. Just as the classification of man, according to race, needs revision in the light of recent discoveries, so the definition of race must be understood anew in the light of genetics. 30 years ago, we talked glibly about the Aryan or Indo-European race, or the Caucasian or Germanic race. All these terms must be discarded. Aryan, Indo-European, and Germanic are only linguistic terms, and Caucasian has no meaning except as used in America to distinguish between whites and colored. Language or culture may spread quickly and widely among the peoples of the earth irrespective of race. For example, the bow and arrow may have originated with some specific race of mankind, yet we find this invention in use all over the globe and in the hands of the most diverse peoples. The use of firearms and of horses by the American Indians indicates nothing more than their contact with the whites. It is unsafe to attribute the inception of any cultural feature to a given race. Civilization itself, that is, agriculture and the domestication of animals, probably arose in West Central Asia, spreading east, south, southwest, and west. Although the earliest remains of the dog, the first animal tamed, are found in the Maglemose in Denmark, approximately 8000 BC, it may have been domesticated far earlier in Asia. There are two centers of the development of civilization, two foci. The first was in southwestern Eurasia, the valley of the Seir Daria, Mesopotamia and its city-states, Chaldea, Babylonia, Assyria, then Egypt, Crete, Greece, Rome, and modern Europe. There is the possibility, or even the probability, of finding in the unexplored portions of southern Arabia connecting links of early culture between the valley of the Euphrates and the valley of the Nile. Recent discoveries indicate a very early civilization in the valley of the Indus, which apparently had been brought down from the north. All these regions formed a single group and were the first center. The second focus was an independent but similar and parallel expansion of civilization in southeastern Asia, now China. There was apparently little intercourse until modern times between the Far East and the far west of Eurasia, except by caravan routes across Central Asia. The Romans knew the silk of China, and there was a certain amount of trade in jewels, precious materials, and spices down through the Middle Ages. But the extraordinary fact that these two cultures developed independently with slight mutual influence of one on the other is little appreciated. Both cultures seem, as said, to have had their origin in West Central Asia and to have radiated southwest, south, and east. One of the periodic cycles of drought desiccated the central area and separated the western and eastern worlds by an almost impassable series of deserts, like the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. In the west, even as late as the time of Alexander the Great, Bactria and Sogdiana, northwest of India, were populous and flourishing states. Here it is that future exploration may uncover the first beginnings of agriculture and the domestication of animals, perhaps also the first written language. Language, like culture, is not identical or coextensive with race to any great degree. Witness the neighboring islands in the West Indies, where Negroes speak Spanish in one, French in another, and English in a third. The language of a given group, at a given time, however, being possibly a much more recent acquirement than its cultural inventions, does show either that it was originated by those who speak it, or that it was imposed upon them by another race long in contact with them. Since we are to deal principally with the racial groups of Europe, namely the Nordic, Mediterranean, and Alpine, we might glance for a moment in more detail at this distinction between race and language. The Mediterraneans of Arabia speak a Semitic language, while the Berbers of North Africa also speak of Mediterranean stock, or also people of Mediterranean stock, speak a Hamitic language. The same Hamitic tongue was probably spoken all around the coast of the Inland Sea and up the west coast of Europe to the British Islands before Aryan speech was brought there by Nordic invaders from the north and east. Meanwhile, the Alpines spoke languages related to Turkey, a Ural-Altaic language, of course, non-Aryan, as they still do in Turkestan, Hungary, and Finland. Where's my hat? What hat? As to the Nordics, it would appear that this race originated the so-called Aryan or Indo-European group of languages. The Aryan tongue was probably developed in South Russia before the long isolation from Asia had been broken. At a period in the 3rd millennium BC, the Aryan language split into two groups. One, the Western or Centum group, which pushed west and north. The other, the Eastern or Satem group, which pushed south and east. The Centum group included Greek, Latin, Celtic, and Germanic languages. Curiously enough, an outlying member of this group, the Tocharian, was spoken in Turkestan as late as the 7th century AD. Oh, I need a hat. Right now, super important. All right. Let's see if I have one. All right. Yeehaw. I'll try not to block the chat. All right, there we go. Where was I? Here. I think I was here. Yeah, no problem. Now, the Satem group, sometimes called Iranian, included the Lithuanian, all the Slavic languages, and those of ancient and modern Persia, and the various forms of Sanskrit spoken in India and Burma. Light-skinned invaders from the northwest appear to have entered India in successive waves and to have introduced the Aryan language known as Sanskrit. They were probably the Sakai or Scythians from South Russia. These Nordics in India can properly be called Aryans, as used otherwise. However, the term Aryan is purely linguistic. Originally, all the tribes who spoke the languages of the Centum and Satem groups were members of the Nordic race. According to recent discoveries in the valley of the Indus, a very elaborate civilization flourished at least 5,000 years ago at Mohenjo-Daro, 400 miles north of the mouth of the river. This civilization was as elaborate as the corresponding culture of Mesopotamia or of Egypt. The racial characters found in the bodies in the burials indicate that the mass of the population was then, as now, of Mediterranean race, but that the ruling class was long-headed and long-faced, and of a tall stature and sturdy build, a type clearly Nordic. In the earliest graves of Ur in Mesopotamia, the skulls are very clearly of a race akin to those on the Indus. All this would tend to throw back the date of the invasion of men from the north by another 1,000 years or more. The same appears to be true of the invasions into Greece of the Achaeans and of the Osco-Umbrians into Italy. The wide distribution of the Satem or Iranian group to the south and west of Asia shows that the Nordics in great numbers conquered the aboriginal inhabitants of those countries and imposed on them the Aryan speech. They invented the caste system to maintain the purity of their blood. In fact, the Hindu word varna means both color and caste. In spite of all their efforts, however, the conquering invaders died out almost completely in India and Persia, leaving behind them only their language and, in some cases, their religion. With this brief review of the essential difference between race and language or culture, we may return to a consideration of humanity in terms of essentially racial characters. The world as a whole can be roughly mapped racially according to the most obvious human differentiation, namely color: white, yellow, red, black, and brown. The white race at the present day dominates Europe, northern Asia in part, Australia, and North America as far south as Mexico, with outposts scattered all over the globe. Eastern Asia is yellow. Southern Asia and North Africa are brown. Africa south of the Sahara Desert is black, and there is a black tinge across southern Asia, as we shall see. The red men, or Americans, with but a small remnant in the United States and Canada, inhabit Latin America, where in some cases their blood is mixed with that of the descendants of Negro slaves, and of course, to a still larger extent, with that of South Europeans. Color, however, is not the only character upon which a racial map of the world could be based. Perhaps a more satisfactory division could be made according to the cross-section of human hair. However, in dealing with the racial groupings of Eurasia, we find different types of humanity arranged in definite zones according to certain outstanding physical characters. Farthest south on the great land area of Eurasia lies a belt of Negroids extending from Ethiopia with intervals through Arabia to the South Seas. The principal racial characteristics of these people are very dark or black skin, dark eyes, tightly curled black hair, and long, i.e. dolichocephalic skulls. In southern Persia, the population shows a Negro admixture, and a distinctly Negroid type is numerous among the pre-Dravidians of India. The Hindus themselves are very dark brown with wavy black hair. A few decades ago, there was much talk of the English officer and the Hindu in the ranks being of the same Aryan blood, because they both spoke widely diverse forms of the great group of Aryan languages. This, of course, did not imply the slightest trace of blood relationship. The Aryan speech of the Hindu had been imposed upon him by his conquerors from the north. Such fallacies were common a generation ago. To the eastward, we find remnants of Negro types in the Malay Peninsula and in the large islands to the east as far as the Philippines. This Negroid type extends also eastward through Melanesia. From this discontinuous distribution, it would appear that the Negroes and Negritos were the original population of southern Eurasia. It is probable that from this region the true Negroes migrated westward into Ethiopia. At a date far earlier than this hypothetical migration westward, an earlier type of Negroid pushed southeast to Tasmania, which was thereafter cut off from the landmass of Australia. In Australia itself, these Tasmanians were absorbed or exterminated by the later coming Australoids from whom they differed materially. The racial tangle in Australia, Papua, and the islands of Melanesia presents great difficulties in classification, but the basic element appears to be Negro, with a large admixture of later Mongoloids coming from Asia. The next zone of human population, superimposed in many cases upon the Negroids, but south of the great central mountain ranges of Eurasia, is constituted by the Mediterranean race. This race is characterized by black wavy hair, very dark eyes, oval face with fairly regular features, dark olive skin, relatively short stature, and a somewhat slight skeletal and muscular structure. This last character is in sharp contrast with the powerful and sturdy build of the next two races to be considered, the Alpine and the Nordic. The principal character of the Mediterranean race, however, is its long, dolichocephalic skull. The Negroes, as we have said, have long skulls, but of quite a different type. The range of the Mediterraneans extends from the western part of the British Isles through Spain and along both coasts of the Mediterranean Sea, down the east coast of Africa to Somaliland. In Asia, it embraces the Arabs, South Persians, most of the Hindus, with an eastward extension. In northeast Africa and India, it is strongly mixed with Negro. Spreading everywhere throughout Europe, north of the territory dominated by the Mediterranean race, and often mixed with it, we find the Alpines. This race is characterized by a somewhat short, stocky build, much sturdier than the Mediterranean, abundant dark but not straight head and body hair, dark eyes, and round, brachycephalic skull. The center of origin of the Alpines was somewhere in Central Asia west of the true Mongols, north of the Mediterraneans, and east of the Nordics, possibly in Turkestan. The Alpines and Mongols are both characterized by a round skull, but in the case of the long-skulled Mediterraneans and the long-skulled Negroes, the type of skull differs appreciably. The Mongols and Alpines have been in close contact for ages. The Mongols have issued again and again from East and Central Asia and submerged the Alpines, driving them westward into Central Europe. There's been a great deal of intermixture, and the Slavic Alpine population of Eastern Europe frequently shows distinctive Mongol traits. However, the two races, while perhaps remotely connected, differ widely. The Alpines, like the Australoids, and to a less extent like the Nordics, have abundant body hair and copious beard, while the Mongols, like their derivatives, the American Indians, are beardless and without body hair. Alpine hair is wavy, that of the Mongols and Mongoloids straight. Alpine features are rather coarse, often with a large prominent nose, while true Mongols have an exceedingly flat face, depressed nose, and a broad space between the eyes. This depressed nose in adult Mongols is the retention of an infantile character, as babies of all races are born with bridgeless noses. As to stature, most Alpines are of moderate height, although those from the Tyrol to Albania, the so-called Dinaric race, are decidedly tall. It was a branch of tall Mongols with a slight admixture of Alpines that crossed into America from Asia and became the ancestors of the American Indians, who are of substantial height, often with prominent, almost hawk-like noses and high cheekbones. We might mention here the Malays, who are essentially Mongols and who pushed down into Indochina and through the Malay Peninsula. There are many traces of their blood in Polynesia. This expansion was relatively recent, and in those localities, there are everywhere indications of earlier races, especially of the very ancient Negroid types, known as Negritos. These Malays extended through the Philippines as far north as Japan, where they met and mingled with a stream of northern Mongoloid immigrants from Korea. The Alpine domain at the present time extends from the center of France eastward in an ever-widening wedge as far as the Himalayas. It includes the bulk of the population of central France, North Italy, South Germany, Switzerland, the provinces of the recent Austrian Empire, and extends through the Balkan states, Russia, Asia Minor, and far into Asia. This race penetrated into and overran Central Europe during relatively recent times, probably at about the beginning of the Bronze Age, approximately 1800 BC. East and north of the Carpathians, about 400 AD, the Alpines had a period of great expansion, chiefly at the expense of the Nordic race, whose distribution we shall discuss presently. As the Nordic tribes moved into the Roman provinces, the lands they vacated were occupied by Alpine Slavs. All these movements may have been caused by the pressure from the east of Asiatic Mongols, who, like the Huns, were beginning their drive toward Europe. The word slave, coming from Slav, reveals the social relation of these Alpines to West Europeans. The westernmost of the Alpine Slavs were called Wends. In Charlemagne's time, they occupied what is now Germany, as far west as the Elbe. In its easternmost range, these Alpines were called Turanians, and were confused with the Mongols of Central Asia, who had again and again conquered them. The remnant of Wends in East Germany, and the Bohemians, most Poles, and South Slavs are all Alpines. The great mass of Russians are of this type, as well as the ancient Avars, Hunagars, Magyars, Cumans, and the Bulgars, all more or less mixed with Mongols. The Armenians are Alpines of an especially pronounced type, and are probably descended from the ancient Hittites. The East European Alpines are saturated everywhere with Mongol blood, dating for the most part from their conquest by the Tatars during the 13th century. The fact that Asia, north of the main mountain ranges, is preeminently the home of round skulls is very significant and suggests remote relationship between Alpine and Mongol. The Alpine skull reaches a most extreme form among the Armenians, who have a very high skull, greatly flattened behind, and somewhat like a sugar loaf in shape. The division of the races of mankind based on long and round skulls is extremely ancient. We find both types among the fossil and semi-fossil skulls at the end of the Paleolithic. The first definite appearance of round skulls mixed with long skulls is found in the burials at Offnet in Bavaria in the Azilian period at the very end of the Paleolithic some 12,000 years ago. From that day to this in France, Bavaria, and elsewhere in Western Europe, as well as in Eastern Europe, the round skulls have expanded their range. This steady increase of round skull Alpines everywhere in Central Europe in recent centuries is one of the most ominous racial facts that confront us. So I'll take a tea break here. So back then, he referred to race. Nowadays we refer to race and that'll just be like, white people or whatever. But he split up everyone into these different categories, and he calls those the races. So when he talks about like racial mixing and stuff, a lot of the times he's talking about, a British person, which would be a Nordic, and then, an Italian. And that's like interracial back then. A lot of these words aren't really used anymore. Like, I don't think pygmy is used anymore. Hottentot's definitely not used. Negrito, I've never even heard that before. I don't even know what that is. I guess I can look it up while I'm drinking tea here. So it's just short, dark-skinned people in Southeast Asia, I guess. It says it's not considered a slur, so that's good. All right, we'll continue. The great French anthropologist Delapouge stated in a recent letter to the author that in France, the cranial index has risen 2 points a century since the Middle Ages, so that France is no longer a Nordic land. This transformation is due, in the opinion of some observers, to a mixture of race in which round-headedness is dominant over long-headedness. In the opinion of the writer, however, it is due to the replacement of one race, the Nordic, by another, the Alpine. The Nordics not only incur disproportionate loss in war, but are also highly nomadic in habit, while the Alpines, on the other hand, stick close to the land and breed persistently. Of the European races, there remains to be considered the Nordics, a people greatly specialized who have developed a fair skin, light-colored eyes, tall stature of sturdy build, and long, i.e. dolichocephalic skulls. The definite mental traits, the slow but long-continued physical development of the Nordics, has culminated in a powerful skeleton and musculature in sharp contrast to that of the Mediterranean race, to which the Nordic is more closely related than to any other. In fact, the mixture of Nordic and Mediterranean in the British Islands may possibly be one of the few advantageous racial crossings. As the homeland of the original Nordic race, we have as yet only guesswork on the part of the anthropologist. When we shall know more about the condition of Central Asia during the glacial period and immediately thereafter, we may get nearer to an answer to the question of where and how this race originated and developed. It is certain, however, that the Nordics were originally located west of the Alpines, in Mongols and north of the Mediterraneans. We have fossil records of 5 or 6 extinct species or genera of man, and more are constantly coming to light in Asia and outlying regions of the Old World. The impulse that forced the ancestors of man to develop his high energy and intelligence probably arose from the onset of the Pleistocene glaciation a million or more years ago. Mankind was then forced apart into widely separated areas where specific characters developed in isolation. The Nordics were most likely cut off from Asia by the Caspian and Aral Seas, which extended far to the north, where they met the oncoming ice. It was west of this barrier that the Nordic race developed its peculiar characters. Later, when the ice retreated and this watery barrier disappeared, the Nordics were inundated again and again by floods of Asiatics. First Alpines and then Mongols. Sometimes the Nordics became the aggressors and expanded eastward in turn, conquering Persia, India, Burma. Blonde invaders of East Asia, called the Green-Eyed Devils, attacked the Great Wall of China as late as 200 BC. They were also called Wusuns, a Tatar word meaning the tall ones. In the long run, however, the Nordics were forced westward. When the retreating glaciers left habitable land in Scandinavia, it was into this region that the first westward migration of the Nordics found its way. This was probably as early as 800 BC. There it was, through the fogs and long winters of the north, that they developed in complete isolation their great stature and musculature, their fair or flaxen hair, and their blue eyes. The continental Nordics, however, who moved westward to settle around the Baltic and North Seas, retained the more generalized characters of brown hair of various shades, and eyes which tend to either brown, gray, or to a less extent blue. The light eyes of the Nordics include light brown or hazel, and may be of any and all shades of gray and green to the deepest violet blue. The racial characters which most notably distinguish the Nordics are the colors of the skin, hair, and eyes. As sharply contrasted with the skin of the Mediterranean peoples, the color of the blood shows through the fair Nordic skin, except when tanned by exposure to the sun. The light-colored hair is almost always blonde in youth, turning darker with age, although in many individuals extreme blondness is retained through life. The brown hair, characteristic of the Nordics of the British Isles and America, runs from light to very dark brown, but blue-black hair, so rare in England and among Native Americans, is never Nordic. The blonde hair may tend towards golden red. In fact, in classic times, red hair seems to have been more common than now, and may be more characteristic of the Celtic Nordics than of the Teutonic Nordics. In race mixtures between blonde and black-haired peoples, the blondness tends to be lost. On the other hand, light-colored eyes are much more persistent, and this sign of Nordic admixture is found about 10 times more frequently than the blonde hair among such peoples as the Albanians, where all other Nordic characters, except stature, seem to have been lost. Hello, Hernian. Yeah, happy Burger Day. I hope you're grilling and having burgers. Even though you don't live in Burgerland, I don't think. Still doesn't hurt to celebrate. For thousands of years, Europe has been an arena of racial mixtures, Over great territories, as we shall see, the Nordic race has been dominant for the past 30 centuries, so that the majority of Alpine and Mediterranean types shows the impress of Nordic characters. For example, in Bavaria are found short, stocky, round-skulled Alpines with extremely blonde hair and blue eyes. The French, who are today preponderantly Alpine, show outcroppings of profound Nordic characters throughout the population. Thus, while pure types exist everywhere in sufficient numbers to enable us to define race, nevertheless there has been so much intermixture in the past that it is hard sometimes to assign a given individual to a specific race. The definition of race, in fact, cannot be based on any one character, but on a preponderance of many racial characters which make up the resultant type. We have now considered the main races of mankind, but should devote space to the Mongols and their derivatives. The Mongol is undoubtedly a very ancient and major subdivision of the Hominidae, but appears to be intrusive in much of its present range. In Southeast Asia and in the Malay countries and islands, it arrived later than the ancient Negroids. The Mongoloids, as stated above, are characterized by a short, stocky build and generally a round skull, very straight black hair with a round cross-section, a broad, flat face with projecting malar bones, and a slanting eye often marked by the Mongol fold. The last characters distinguish them from the Alpine race, but are sometimes to be found in such members of that race as have a Mongoloid admixture. These Mongolian characters occur often in Bohemia and Moravia, and especially in Galicia, in which last province they probably date from the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. Such traits, however, are not found among the Alpines of southern Germany or France. In the American Indians, Mongoloid blood undoubtedly predominates, but the high-bridged nose of some of the tribes and their high stature undoubtedly point to admixture with other races. The Mongol is not inferior to the Nordic in intelligence, as is the Negro, but represents such a divergent type that the mixture between Nordics and Chinese or Japanese is not a good one. The overflow of these Asiatics into our Pacific coast might have Mongolized the states there, had not the American laboring man taken alarm and taken legislation forbidding their immigration. With the foregoing as a simple and generalized description of the primitive races of mankind as we know them today, and with special emphasis on the three principal European variants of the white race, we shall proceed to consider the distribution and racial influence of the Nordics in Western Europe. So, we didn't really get into the United States at all today, even though it's the 4th of July. But that kind of lays a background. It gives a pretty good summary of the discussion and the passing of the Great Race, his previous work. So he's just laying a background down for us. Yeah, there isn't really much to say about that. Just kind of like an info dump. A lot of it's kind of stuff we know nowadays. Like, yeah, everyone knows what an Indian looks like now. But back then, people probably didn't know what people from India looked like. So, he just kind of goes through and describes everything. That's all we're reading for today. So next time, I'll probably do this again next week. We'll read about the Nordic conquest of Europe and the next few chapters after that. Where's the table of contents? Yeah. So I think we'll probably do the next two chapters next week. The conquest of Europe, and then we'll finally get into the settlement of America. So we'll finally be talking about the good old USA. I never even thought about how you can't know about other races. Yeah, I mean, this was written in the 30s, so. You're Nordic? Yeah, me too. He was talking about how, some children are blonde and then their hair turns brown when they get older. That's me. My hair was very blonde when I was a child. It was like practically white almost. And now it's almost white again. Huh. Great. But that's for other reasons. But it turned brown more or less like in my late teens, 20s, around there. Yeah, that's all I'm gonna read for today. So hopefully everyone here has a good 4th of July. Even if you're not American, have a burger. Have a burger and a beer. I'm going to be drinking some beer later. Not right now. I still have some reading to do off stream. I don't like to drink while I read. But yours turned a few years ago. Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't really like a sudden thing, but it just like all of a sudden I was like, oh, yeah, I'm not really blonde anymore. Because I was putting blonde on my driver's license, and then I was like renewing it, and I was like, yeah, I can't really say that anymore, can I? Pretty soon I'm going to have to put gray. So yeah, 4th of July, that's what I was talking about. Yeah, I'll see you later. Thanks for stopping by. Thank you, Hernan, as well, for stopping by. And if anyone was lurking, thank you. And tomorrow I'll be playing Sonic CD. We're getting back to Sonic after binging Undertale, or Deltarune rather, all last week. So I'm glad to get back into some Sonic. And I think this is the last old 2D Sonic game. Maybe there's one more. I'll have to look into it, but it's either just this one or one other one, and then we'll be getting into the 3D ones, and that's when you start getting into the shit. So I'm looking forward to that, because I played Sonic Adventure 2, and that's it. So I'm looking forward to playing some of the more interesting titles like Sonic Unleashed or whatever. But yeah, thank you for being with me again today, and I'll see you all tomorrow for Sonic CD. Bye.